Gary Gunderson and Larry Perret named 5 causes of life. You can probably say half of them by now. Connection, coherence, agency, blessing, and today we are on hope. Opening their chapter on hope, they write the following, and I'm going to quote their words. Of all the 5 leading causes of life, only one requires an adjective if we are to discern its true meaning. That cause is hope, and the adjective is informed. Informed hope is a leading cause of life. Wishful thinking will not suffice. Optimism, which is devoid of reality, can bring us both to denial and to despair. But informed hope is grounded in life itself. It is an event, not an event, it is a process. It is not afraid of discouraging facts. It knows that magical thinking is often an escape from life, whereas informed hope is of life. That's the end of their quote. If informed hope is the hope that brings us life, the question arrives, is informed by what? What information can make the difference between a life with hope and a life that feels hopeless? Or put it another way, what is it that we need to know to have hope? Hope is not optimism. With optimism, we think about the past and how things have happened before, and we look at our present circumstances and we anticipate that something good might happen. That's optimism. Obviously, optimism is easier for some people with some paths than it might be for other people who have different paths. It's good to have optimism if you can, but it's not hope. Hope has to do with good things in the future that comes to us outside the normal expectations of life. The future associated with hope is a gift of expecting something new. If you belong to a group that call themselves Christians, a part of what informs you, a part of what you know, is found in here. In this very eclectic combination of stories about people who discovered in life more than they could have expected. I would like to remind you today of one of those stories. It happens to be the gospel reading in today's lectionary, and that story demonstrates how we might learn from a story that comes from another time and place, and how that story might teach us a worldview that allows us to have our hope grow. Your bulletin will tell you we are reading John 12. But actually, I'm going to jump back one chapter to 11 to read a little prequel. So at the beginning of chapter 11, it reads like this. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, from the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now before it tells you any more of the story, verse 2 tells you, Martha was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. The writer, having made sure that you make the connection between these stories, then continues on. So the sister sent a message to Jesus. Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard that, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, although Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Now you may remember, as the story progresses, that Jesus showed up too late to be of any help at the healing department. Lazarus, his friend, was already dead. Mary blames him for her brother's death. Jesus goes to the tomb where Lazarus was laid to rest, and he dissolves into tears. Then he calls to Lazarus and says, come out. And Lazarus emerges alive. The news of what happened spread quickly among people who are interested in becoming Jesus' followers, but it also spread quickly among people who were interested in having Jesus disappear. The chief priest Caiaphas, fearing political retribution, said, "It's better to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." It is beginning to look like Jesus' fate is sealed. So now we come to today's reading, chapter 12. "6 days before the Passover, Jesus comes to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those who was at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointing Jesus' feet and wiping them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, 'Why is this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?' He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. She brought it so she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me.'" The word of the Lord. You know, very often this story is analyzed in terms of the difference between the quality of discipleship of Mary and that of Judas. But since this morning we are talking about hope, I can see no reason to give Judas any attention at all. It is painfully obvious, both in his life and in his death, that he is not a person from whom one can acquire any knowledge that leads to hope. Judas is a man without hope, so we are not going to concentrate on him. I want to concentrate on Mary. There are at least 7 distinctly different Marys in the gospel stories. This one is Mary, who has a sister named Martha. She's the Mary who sat and learned at Jesus' feet. And the next part of the sermon is written and spoken from her point of view. Most of the people in Bethany come from large families, but in our family, there's always been just the 3 of us. Mom died when I was a baby. Dad chose not to get remarried. My older sister Martha tried to be the mother in our home, always working, always worrying, always trying to raise Lazarus and I. There was times she could be a pain in the neck with her bossiness. And sometimes, when we were younger, we gave her fits. But she held us together. Sometimes it's hard to remember that she's really only a couple of years older than we are. Because she was needed at home, Martha never married. And because our family was financially solvent, there was no immediate need to find a husband for me either. You know, sometimes a family has to get rid of an extra daughter. I remember my childhood friend, Rima, who was married at 9 years of age. Her family was poor and they needed her to be someplace else. Too many mouths to feed, you know. I haven't seen her since her wedding. At the time I'm telling you about, I was about 17 and I still wasn't married. Something of an old maid, I guess, but it was good to stay with my family. Father had died 2 springs earlier when the fever swept through the town. Lazarus stepped into his shoes and was managing pretty well. We all tried to do our part. Then came the night when Lazarus woke. He was sweating, he was feverish. He could respond to anything that was said to him. We tried to do everything we knew how to do, but we didn't know how to do too much. What can you do in the face of a sickness that can kill you in a couple of days? What can you do? Martha had a plan. She said, "I'll send for Jesus. He heals people. I've seen him do it. He is our friend, so he will surely come." We placed such hopes in his coming. When he showed up, everything would be okay, we told each other. That's how it's going to work. Jesus is going to come, and Lazarus would be well. But he didn't get well. He just became sicker and sicker and weaker. And then he died. He was alive one moment, and then he died. Martha got up and left the room. She never would cry in front of me. When she came back, she was all business. We have to wash the body, she said, and get it ready for burial. How can Martha use that language? When did my beloved brother turn into the body? Nothing made sense. Everything seemed dark and impossible. We had a jar of nard. We used a little bit of it for Father's death, and now we used it for Lazarus, sparingly, because it was costly. A little nard and all the customary spices as well. We wrapped my brother from head to toe in linen, and some friends and cousins helped carry him to our family tomb. We left him there amongst the boxes that held the bones of our father and our mother and the rest of the family, all dead. We went home to a house full of people who were trying to comfort us, and trying to console us, and I would have preferred a house that was quiet. It's hard to explain, but the death of my brother hit me harder than the death of my father. Maybe it's because he was closer to my age. Maybe it was because we were closer to each other. You have to treat your father with decorum. But I remember I used to chase Lazarus and try to hit him with dirt clods after he teased me. I don't think I ever hit him. But either way, he'd just laugh at me, and I can still see how he would throw his head back when he laughed. And Jesus didn't even show up for 2 more days. And when he finally came, Martha went to see him and greet him and talk to him. In her grief, she's still trying to do everything that should be done. I was not in the mood to join them. But Martha came in and pulled me aside. "The teacher is here and is calling for you," she told me. I went out and I planned to say, I don't know, something. But what blurted out of my mouth was, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." That wasn't the thing to say. I don't know. I was angry. It seemed like the one person who might have been able to help had let us down. I remember looking up and seeing tears in Jesus' eyes. I remember my anger melting away. We all went out to the tomb, and then in a blur of events that still makes no sense to me, my brother was walking towards us and was alive. It was amazing, joyful, and scary all at the same time. Some people who had heard what had happened began to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. That part was good, I guess. But others said that Jesus was a danger to everyone. Some even hinted it would be best for everyone if Jesus was handed over to the authorities. This is too big to hush up. Everybody was talking about it. The Romans would soon hear all the commotion. No one knew what might happen next. Jesus went into hiding. I heard that he and some of his disciples traveled to Ephraim. That's practically out in the wilderness area. Back at home, the 3 of us felt oddly responsible for all of this. In a way, we hoped that Jesus would stay away where it was safe. But he didn't. Passover was coming. Jesus was determined to be in Jerusalem for Passover. The city would be full of pilgrims. Would this be a start of a revolution? Or would the Roman army squash the whole thing? Or would Jesus leave before the trouble started? Or what? There are no words for the responsibilities, the possibilities that might fill in that blank. So we spoke to one another in hushed words, and we waited. But before he went to Jerusalem, Jesus came by to visit us. Martha was known to set forth a bountiful table, and this time was no different. But the meal, which should have been something of a celebration, was oddly subdued. Something had changed. Lazarus was alive and eating and talking, but there was this odd feeling of death in the air. We tried to take Jesus in, to care for him, to shut the door firmly on the world for one night at least. But what was going on outside would not be silenced. Jesus had been safe, out of reach of those who might harm him. But when he returned to Bethany, and even more when he got up in the morning to go into Jerusalem, he was going to be in real danger. I remember looking at my brother and thinking, he gave up, thinking about events and thinking that my brother was now probably going to outlive the man who had brought him back to us. I remember looking at Jesus and thinking he gave up his life for my brother. And Jesus looked at me and saw me staring at him. What did I read in his expression? It was hard to say. It wasn't fear. I wouldn't call it confidence either. It was a look that had a depth in it that was hard to fathom. And it occurred to me that when the impossible happened, it would happen in Jerusalem, and I wouldn't be there to see it happen. There was nothing I could do. There was no way I could stop it. I couldn't even help bury him if it came to that. And I thought, I can't just wait in dread. I have to do something. Something. Doing something was better than doing nothing. When I came out of the storeroom with a jar in my hand, I had planned to, I don't know what, planned to use a little of it somehow to show something, to do. All right, so I didn't have it well planned out. But all of a sudden the thought came to mind, don't save any of it back. He isn't saving any of it back, and nothing is more important than right now. Some people criticized what I did. Some people said I was prophetic. Jesus said that I had done it for him, and that much is true. Now, that was several years ago, and today I belong to the Way, the ecclesia of Jesus' followers. I know the story of Jesus' death. I have talked to those who went to seek him in the tomb, and I've talked to those who saw him in the first frantic days following his rising from the grave. I can tell the story of the good news of Jesus' life and death and life, and I do so as often as I can. But sometimes I also tell the story that I just told you. Life as a believer has not been easy. As you know, these are hard times. But we have been given, as the disciple Peter is fond of saying, a new birth into a living hope. We have this hope not because we can predict what God will do, but because we can always trust the love that God has for us. This story of Mary's is only one of hundreds of stories that are found in the Scripture. Some are easier to relate to than others. What these stories have to offer us is more obvious in some of them than it is in others. But this combination of the Bible stories, coupled with our own experience of the presence of God, is what forms a bedrock of knowledge that helps form our faith. And if it shapes our Christian faith, then it certainly informs our hope. Our Christian hope is not that somehow God is going to protect us from all the bad things in life. Our Christian hope is in a God who has suffered and faced death, a God who took on flesh and lived among us, who experienced all the goodness and joys of life, the pain and brokenness of life. For instance, he could feel the pain of the death of one he loved. He could feel the pain of betrayal and abandonment, or the sting of injustice, and he accepted the physical torture that came with it. He suffered and died on a cross, but remarkably, he was not defeated. Author and pastor Barbara Brown Taylor says, Christianity is the only world religion that confesses a God who suffers. The cross teaches us that God's power is not the power to force human choices and end human pain. It is instead the power to pick up the shattered pieces and make something holy of them. Think about Mary's story. We started this morning with a question. If informed hope brings us life, how does it inform us? What is it that informs us? Everyone would have a different answer to that question. It depends on their experience, on their education, on their family, on their society, on their faith, and a whole bunch of other factors. For those of us blessed with a knowledge of Scripture, we have a foundation for hope in God's grace and God's goodness. And upon deeper reflection, we realize we often also have reason to have hope in ourselves and in the people around us. As Christians, let us take our hope into the world, help pick up the shattered pieces that we find, and make something holy of them.